Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. By way of background, everyone, I'm a political scientist, and I study immigration politics, but also backlash to it, the consequences of demographic change. And my work that's relevant to this particular webinar relates to two books that I've written. One is called The New Minority, which Denzel was kindly holding up, and also the other one's called The White Working Class, What Everyone Needs to Know. And these works are all based on a variety of different analyses that I've undertaken, two full immersion ethnographies of white working class communities in the US and also in the United Kingdom, but also a pretty extensive survey analysis of public attitudes. And what's unique about my work actually is that a lot of it was done before 2016. So in many ways, I'm one of the few people who actually have a sort of unbiased view of white working class attitudes, so that we can kind of understand them in the lead up to the populist wave and the anti-immigrant wave that led to the election of Donald Trump, but also a variety of other xenophobic personalities across the world. And so it's with these data, these ethnographic data, but also survey data, that I share this presentation with you all. So the way I'm going to describe everything is in the form of three common misunderstandings about white working class people, and then also three truths that I think are very important. And the goal here is to really understand a group of people who, immigration advocates, people who want to protect immigrants and promote immigration, really cannot succeed without at least attracting some share of them, without connecting in some way. And I think that the argument here is that the victory from an immigrants protection and immigration promotion perspective relies in many ways on the capacity for the movement to actually reach out to this population that's very much anxious and feeling marginalized, which has led to the sort of backlash that we're trying to understand. So the three misunderstandings, as a brief overview, relate to the ideas that one, white working class people vote against their interests. Two, that everybody understands racism in the same way. And three, that demography is in fact destiny. And I'll go through each of these right now and then move on to the truths I want to share. So the first misunderstanding, that many white working class people vote against their interests. So this is the idea that a vote for the Republican Party, for anti-immigrant politicians, for Donald Trump, is an irrational choice by many white working class people, that they're voting against their interests. And of course, when we say that, we're really assuming that the interests in question here are material interests, they're economic interests. But one of the things I want to emphasize very strongly is that white working class people are as rational of voters as anyone else, and that they basically have sensed that over the last 40 years, they have been redlined by political parties, that they have been ignored in many ways, maybe visited every 4 years for presidential elections, but otherwise either taken for granted or ignored. And this is for good reason. They pose problems for the conventional Republican and Democratic agendas. For Republicans, historically, white working class people, they could get along with the sense of racial resentment, sort of xenophobia out there from the social side, but Republicans could not get along with white working class people's anti-trade beliefs and concern with restructuring the economy. And so it really didn't work well for Republicans. And for Democrats, they could get along with the sort of anti-trade sentiments and economic restructuring, but not the racial resentment. And so both parties effectively left them out. And in many ways, the Democratic Party, like a lot of other left of center parties around the world, have developed a closer alignment with the financial class, which has led to a reduced amount of distinction between left and right as it relates to economics. And this means that the real distinctions across many of the major mainstream parties around the world have become more along social lines. There have been more about social issues and cultural issues. And that's exactly where white working class people have voted, that their interests are not maybe economic interests in mind. They're voting with their social interests, with their cultural interests. And if you think about it, these are the kinds of interests that we usually champion among wealthy, millionaires and billionaires who support the Democratic Party. We've heard people say that people like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett are enlightened because they're able to set aside their social interests, set aside their material interests in favor of their social interests. But that's precisely what many white working class people are doing. They're setting aside their material interests to appeal to their social interests. And that's really where battles are being fought right now, and in many ways lost by the left and the pro-immigrant left. So that's the first misunderstanding I wanted to make sure we clarify. The second is that everybody understands racism in the same way. So when I was going out into the field, I began to notice that a number of my subjects would preface their statements to me by saying, now, Justin, I'm not a racist, but ... And of course, what would then come often was racist, or at least prejudiced in some kind of ways. But in many cases, it wasn't actually. In many cases, what would follow had very little to do with racism. And I began to wonder, why exactly were my subjects prefacing all their statements with, "No, I'm not a racist, but." And it's because they understand racism in a different way. So for many of us, racism is a really important social concept that alerts us to our implicit biases and the double standards that we create. But for many white working class people, racism has become a mute button. It's become a way of silencing people. When we say, "Don't listen to what she has to say, she's a racist," or "what he says doesn't matter because he's a racist." So when white working class people were saying to me, "Now, I'm not a racist, but," what they were actually saying was, "Listen to what I'm about to share with you. Don't dismiss me. Don't disqualify me." And it reveals that sense of sensitivity around racism, and it's, from their perspective, abuse. Now, many of you may be thinking, let's not be facile. Surely they understand that, there are white privileges and invisible wages of whiteness that are granted to people throughout American history. But from the perspective of one of my subjects, when I said this to her, she said, "I'm one car accident, one unexpected medical bill away from that trailer park over there. What privilege, what advantages are you speaking about? What are you talking about?" The third myth, the third misunderstanding that I want to address is that demography is destiny. And this is the idea that was sort of being battered around the Washington, D.C. region and other parts of the country, that if we just wait long enough, that the demography of the American population is going to change, and a more racially diverse and more tolerant demography, electorate is going to emerge. And we just need to wait for that to happen, and then we'll start to win victories. And that's just, unfortunately, incorrect. So the demography, for the demographic nature of the United States to change, it's going to require an enormous amount of time, actually, for about 25 years before the country is majority minority, and even longer before the electorate is majority minority. And it's unclear whether the electorate will even stay along the partisan lines that they're already in. So it's going to be, it's really a complacent way of looking at things, and it doesn't actually align with the data that suggest how the American electorate will change, nor can we really predict the attitudinal consequences of it. So now I just want to move on to the three truths that I want to emphasize before the conclusion of this presentation. The first is that anti-immigrant sentiment is more passionate than pro-immigrant sentiment. It's important to understand that an enormous amount of Americans now rate, about a third according to Pew, now rate immigration as the #1 political issue in deciding how they vote. But what we have to understand and recognize is that for those people for whom it is the #1 political issue, they're largely against immigration. They're far more passionately against immigration than the people who actually rate it #1 are for immigration. And so the wave behind immigration is simply not as strong as the wave against it right now, which means that we have to start building bridges to other communities. The second truth that I want to emphasize is that the reasons why people are voting for the farther right now and for anti-immigrant politicians, it's not just about race, and it's not just about economics. It's actually about both. What I find in my research, and the most powerful trend inside of the voting data that I see, is actually a threat to status. Many white working class people, and many white people more broadly in the United States, are concerned that they are losing position in their society, losing a sense of power, losing a sense of self-determination in the country they feel like they once defined. And so what we are seeing is that this is actually the role of race and economics are both inextricable from this. They're so deeply intertwined that we have to think of these things as holistic. Finally, the way forward here is that we have to actually appeal to the white working class people in ways that we probably have not hitherto. What's clear is that the messages that people have brought together, the identities that we are developing, are not actually relating in many ways to this hardcore of the white working class who has felt marginalized. In many ways, what they're looking for is an appreciation of heritage, but also a sense of control over the country and the demography of the country that they feel like they have some role and roots in. And so it really is contingent in many ways on the redefinition of who we are, that is as Americans, that is actually inclusive of all, not just inclusive of new Americans, but inclusive of the older Americans that set the tone for this country going forward. And so the question is, how inclusive can the immigrant rights movement be? Can we actually relate to people who were previously our antagonists?